The year is 1992. Euro Disney has just opened in Paris, Windows 3.1 was launched, absolutely fabulous debuts on British TV, and I turned 10 years old. After doing some research into 1987 for my Amiga video, I promised I would never start a video like this again. Look, I'm never starting a video like this again. See? But the early 90s really were an amazing time to be growing up, and there was a real smell of optimism in the air. I lived a childhood that was not too far away from the film Stand By Me, only with less dead bodies. Me and my friends were always out and about on our bikes, playing in the woods and generally doing kid stuff. Times were much safer back then because paedophilia hadn't been invented yet. And in September of that year, my greatest wish would come true. I was going to be getting a Sega Mega Drive of my very own. Up until that point, I'd had to make do with my older brother's abandoned Pong machine. I had played his Spectrum under supervision, and my best mate at the time also had a Spectrum too. But, as anyone who was around at that time will testify, the Spectrum was not a particularly reliable machine, and when it did work, the graphics were far from par for the time. I grew up in a seaside town, with a full seafront festooned with arcades. Going down there and playing futuristic titles like Final Fight, Street Fighter, Afterburner, Metal Slugs, and then going home and playing the 128k version of Double Dragon, it was a bit of a step down. But thanks to Sega, the times, they were a-changing. The Sega Mega Drive promised the arcade in your home, and that was just what I wanted. I'd always had a bit of a soft spot for Sega due to playing on the Master System a couple of times in the past, and now they'd brought 16 bits to the party. Adapted from Sega's System 16 arcade board, the Sega Mega Drive used a Motorola 68000 CPU running a clock speed of 7.6 MHz, backed up by a Yamaha YM7101 GPU chip, with full RGB encoding capabilities and a Zilog Z80 sound chip capable of full high-definition stereo sound. It had 72 kilobytes of system RAM and 64 kilobytes of video RAM, meaning it could display a total of 61 colors at any one time, and from a palette of 512. GameSack are going to sue me for copyright infringement. Now, some of these specs may seem a little low compared to the Amiga that I featured last month's, and you'd be right. But the Mega Drive had just had a price drop to £120, whilst the newly launched Amiga 600 would set you back £400. Oddly enough, the Amiga 1200 launched the very same year as well, and that had an entry price of £400. Good idea, Commodore, good idea. Either way you cut it, the Sega Mega Drive was half the price of the Commodore machines, and with their youth-orientated marketing campaign full of 90s tood, the Mega Drive was a console kids were nagging for. The SNES was also out, but it had a price of 150 quid, and honestly, it never even featured on me and my friend's radar. Like, all we ever talked about was the Sega Mega Drive. Like, how much we wanted one, how cool Streets of Rage or Sonic was. The SNES never even got a look in. Looking back at that time, it was hard to see why the SNES wasn't more of a staple among me and my peers. And believe me, it just wasn't. There was a total of 5 boys in Mrs. Wilkinson's Year 5 class that all had Sega Mega Drives. It wasn't for another 2 years before one of us decided to break with convention and buy a SNES. And it's not like the console didn't sell well in the UK either. I mean, that thing was a powerhouse. The only logical reason I can come up with is that it was the cheapest of the two, so it was a much easier sell to our parents. That and the aggressive marketing push that Sega aimed squarely at our age range. Nintendo had opted for Rick Mail of Bottom fame for their ad campaigns, a sure hit with the teenage rebellion market, whereas Sega went for a series of trippy, shouty adverts that totally overpowered our preteen minds. Plus, they had the Sega Kid, who was effectively a really cool surrogate older brother, and if he liked Sega, it must be cool. They even went as far as taking the battle to the streets. At my local kids park, I can remember them turning up with the Sega bus. It was a big double-decker bus that was filled with Sega Mega Drives, all hooked up to CRT tellies with Sonic the Hedgehog 1 on them. Now, just Nintendo never did that kind of thing, or certainly not that I can remember anyway. Okay, so enough of me yammering about how good the Sega Genesis was. Now let's talk games. I have a bit of a problem there. I mean, what do I talk about? If I talk about the massive games that were on the system, everyone will all be all like, we know about Sonic. If I'm talking about games that only purely came out on the Mega Drive and never came out on any other system, that's actually a relatively low number of titles. Most of them had multiplats on the Master System or on the Amiga or other places like that. You've only really got games like Gunstar Hero and things like that that were purely and simply just for the Mega Drive, and everyone knows about those as well. Or I could talk about really obscure titles that hardly anyone's ever heard of. But the problem with that is there's usually a reason why nobody's ever heard of them. What to do? I guess I'll just talk about the games that I like the most. That way I get to play them again, so I get the footage. Now let's get the ball rolling with Road Rash. Published in 1991 by EA before they became the Antichrist, Road Rash was a game that exemplified what gaming was like in the early 90s. Let's make a bike racing game. Might get a little boring though. Oh, I know. How about we set it on the open streets and you get to hit people with chains and bats? Yeah, now that's what I'm talking about. I mean, what a class game with a really simple play loop. Race bikes and hit other dudes to try to win races to earn money, use the money to buy better bikes, to win more races, to hit more dudes. The music was great, the controls were great, the graphics were great, like literally no weak links. And you got to hit the cops too. Back then, every mainstream AAA studio was pulling Rockstar moves, and no one batted an eyelid. It was just expected. Sparkster was a sequel to Rocket Knight Adventures, in which you took control of an anthropomorphic possum in blue armour with a jetpack. Produced and released by Konami in 1994, most people prefer the original Rocket Knight, but he couldn't do this. And the music. Dear God, the music. It's quite bizarre how much I love this game. I'd never even heard of it back in 1994. The first time I played it I was 21, and by that point I'd already played the PS2 for at least 2 years. And then I came across this and a huge list of ROMs I got my hands on, and I was absolutely blown away. It was 16-bit at its finest. When everyone wants to prove just how powerful the Super Nintendo was compared to the Genesis, they always pull out old favourites like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX and other games that utilise the Nintendo's FX chip. And very impressed we all were back in the day. But Sega, on the other hand, they weren't impressed. They were just pissed. Virtua Racing came out in 1994 and used their all-new SVP chip built into the cartridge. Now this game did cost a pretty penny back in the day, but holy shit did it run rings around anything coming from the red corner. It had a much higher polygon count, further draw distance, and so many frames per second. Running them side by side, you can just see how much smoother Virtua Racing is compared to Stunt Race FX, which was released the very same year. And Stunt Race FX was bordered. This was the first time I played a racing game at home that really felt like I was going fast. All the old sprite-based games suddenly felt very, very old. Okay, I guess we can't talk about the Sega Mega Drive without talking about the best game on the system. This was a game that nobody else had an answer for. Although it started out life as a rip-off of one of its competitors' products, it was a game that was designed purely and simply because they knew that Nintendo were going to get one of the biggest arcade hits as an exclusive, and they wanted to prevent a Nintendo whitewash.
By the time they refined it for its second outing, it had far and away outshone the original inspiration for this game and became a genre-defining title. A game that to this day still reigns supreme over its kingdom, without a single challenger coming close to dethroning it. I am of course talking about Streets of Rage 2. When Sega released this gem into the world, they'd managed to either improve on or match every single aspect of the games it was mimicking. The soundtrack was every bit as good as Final Fight, the sprites were nearly as big and every bit as detailed. It had more moves, more weapons, tighter controls, just everything. And that's comparing it to the arcade version of Final Fight, not the weak sauce stripped down censored version that ended up making its way to the Super NES. This game was fully arcade ready, and it was yours to play at home whenever you wanted, no quarters required. It's kind of hard to go anywhere after Streets of Rage 2. I mean, there's Sonic, Quackshot, Gunstar Heroes, Comic Zone, The Revenge of Shinobi, Golden Axe 2, Dynamite Heady, Mickey Mouse and Castle of Illusion, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, Alien Soldier. Well, there's quite a few there, but with the exception of Sparkster, not one of those games made it to the Super Nintendo. Sure, we didn't have Mario World or Donkey Kong or Star Fox or Zelda or Mario Kart or Super Metroid, but believe me, we were fine. Just for the record, I do love the Super Nintendo too. I'm doing okay for SNES games and I have another 6 in the mail, so don't for 1 minute think I'm beating up on the Super Nintendo. I just think that with it being so successful in the US, people often seem to think of it as being the beginning and the end of the 16-bit discussion. Now, whilst towards the end of its lifespan, the Mega Drive did develop some pretty nasty tumours. In 1989, it was Genesis. To play us out in what appears to be a very worrying trend in these kind of videos of mine, we have Yuzo Koshiro's classic and absolutely brutal track for Streets of Rage 2, Expander. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, particularly dancing at the end. That took an awful lot of work. Many thanks to my camera girl, who was professional and at no point laughed at me and will hold it against me for the rest of my life. I put out a video like this, possibly not with so much dancing, once every sort of 4 weeks. The rest of the time I'm doing devlog videos for my games company and also other general jibber jabber videos. So tune in Wednesdays and Sundays for more aceness. Comment, subscribe, like. I'm past caring right fucking now. I'm past caring.
So hot right now. Yes, boss. Yes. So scared of the camera. So scared of the camera. Are you happy?
Am I happy? Is this what you want?
Is this what you want?
Is this what you want? Subscribe, bitches!